The red dust had always been sacred to their people, but young Kyle didn't understand why until the morning her sister stopped breathing. The band of 32 souls living in the limestone caves overlooking the valley had weathered many storms, but this invisible enemy was different. It started with the eldest, a woman of perhaps 45 seasons they called Naya, who began coughing blood 3 sunrises ago. The other children were already showing signs: fever, weakness, the terrible cough. The band's leader, a scarred hunter called Jorin, had made the difficult decision to separate the sick from the healthy. 7 members showing symptoms were moved to the smaller cave adjacent to their main shelter. Among them was his own son, Tam, a boy of 10 seasons whose bright eyes were now dulled with fever. Jorin's mate, Vera, tended to the sick despite the danger, her knowledge of healing herbs their only defense against this mysterious illness that seemed to steal breath from the body. Old Garrick, keeper of memories and stories, recognized this sickness from tales passed down through generations. His grandfather's grandfather had spoken of a time when the breath stealer came, taking half a band in the span of 1 moon. But those stories also contained hope. They spoke of survivors, of rituals performed, and most mysteriously, of the dead being sent forward with the red earth to ensure their journey to the next place. Terms that had seemed like mere stories now felt urgently real. As night fell, the healthy members gathered at the cave mouth, maintaining distance from the sick chamber. The sound of coughing echoed off limestone walls, punctuated by children's whimpers. Shara had begun grinding ochre with unusual intensity, creating more of the sacred red powder than ever before. She mixed it with animal fat and water, creating paints of different consistencies. Her movements were purposeful, ritualistic, as if following instructions whispered by ancestors through her blood memory. By morning, 3 more had died: Lyra, old Naya, and, surprisingly, a strong young hunter named Dren, who had shown symptoms only the day before. The bodies lay in the sick chamber, and the living faced a terrible decision. In the past, the dead were left in distant places for scavengers, returned to the cycle of life. But something about this death felt different. The way the illness took them, the suffering involved, seemed to demand a new response. Shara spoke first. They need protection for journey. The concept was revolutionary and disturbing. Protection after death implied continuation, suggested that the person somehow persisted beyond their last breath. But as they looked at little Lyra's still form, the idea of leaving her for hyenas felt impossibly wrong. Jorin, despite his practical nature, found himself agreeing. These deaths were not from hunt or accident. They were being taken by something unseen. Perhaps they needed unseen protection in return. The red ochre seemed to offer that promise. Shara directed the preparation with an authority that surprised everyone, including herself. She seemed to be following a pattern she'd never learned but somehow knew. First, the bodies were washed with water from the sacred spring. Then, most remarkably, she began to position them carefully, not randomly dropped but deliberately placed. Lyra was curled as if sleeping, her favorite shell necklace placed around her neck. The positioning seemed to matter, though none could articulate exactly why it did. The real innovation came when Shara began to coat the bodies with ochre. Not just a light dusting, but a thick application that covered every inch of skin. Young Kale watched her mother work, memorizing every movement. Somehow she knew this knowledge would define her people's future relationship with death itself. As Shara worked, others began to understand and contribute. Vera brought medicinal herbs she'd been using to treat the sick, placing them around the bodies. A hunter offered his best spear point to be placed with Dren. Even practical Jorin found himself selecting a piece of worked bone to accompany old Naya. These weren't random offerings. Each item was chosen for its connection to the deceased, its potential usefulness in whatever came next. They were inventing meaning in real time, creating tradition. The digging began at dawn. Jorin had chosen a spot inside the cave itself, another radical departure from tradition. The limestone floor was hard, requiring stone tools and determination to break through. But as they dug, something remarkable happened. They found an older layer of red earth beneath, as if the cave itself validated their choice. The hole grew deeper than necessary for mere disposal. This was construction, architecture of the afterlife. They were building a room for the dead within the earth. Young Kyle was tasked with preparing special ochre while the adults dug. This wasn't the regular red powder, but a special mixture Shara had devised. She added crushed flowers that grew near the sacred spring, tiny shells from the ancient beach deposits, and most remarkably, drops of blood from living relatives. Each addition was deliberate, symbolic. The resulting paste shimmered differently in the firelight, seeming almost alive. Kyle understood she was witnessing the birth of sacred chemistry. The placement of bodies became a careful choreography. Lyra was laid first, at the eastern side of the grave where the morning sun would touch if it could penetrate the earth. She was positioned on her right side, knees drawn up, hands placed near her face as if sleeping. But this was more than sleep positioning. Shara oriented her facing the cave entrance toward the world of the living. The message was clear. The dead were not turned away from life, but positioned to observe it from their new vantage. Dren the hunter was placed next, his body adorned with ochre patterns that told his life story. Straight lines for successful hunts, circles for the children he'd fathered, wavy patterns for the rivers he'd crossed. Shara painted these while chanting in a rhythm none had heard before, words that seemed to come from beyond memory. The other band members began to hum along, creating a sound that filled the cave with vibrational presence. The painting transformed Dren from corpse to narrative artwork. Old Naya required different treatment. As an elder, she was positioned centrally, the others arranged around her as if she was teaching even in death. Her body was covered not just in ochre, but in patterns of white chalk as well, creating contrast that suggested wisdom and age. In her hands they placed her grinding stone, the tool she'd used to prepare food for the band for decades, but they also added something unprecedented, a small piece of ochre itself, as if she might need to perform rituals. The grave goods evolved from simple possessions to symbolic statements. With Lyra, they placed not just her shell necklace, but also an unfinished one she'd been making, representing potential interrupted. Seeds from edible plants were scattered around all three bodies, suggesting sustenance or perhaps rebirth. Most remarkably, they included items the dead had made for others. Dren's half-finished spear, Naya's partially woven basket. Death hadn't ended their contributions, it had transformed them into offerings. As the arrangement neared completion, something unexpected happened. Tam, Jorin's fevered son, insisted on being carried to the grave despite his weakness. The 10-year-old boy produced a small carved antler, a toy Lyra had loved. His offering sparked a procession of the sick, each adding something personal despite their weakness. The boundary between living and dead seemed to blur as the ill participated in the burial, perhaps seeing their own potential futures but refusing to surrender to fear about it. Vera introduced another innovation. She began to line the grave with stones, creating a boundary between the earth and the bodies. But these weren't random stones. Each was selected from meaningful locations: the river where Lyra learned to swim, the hillside where Dren made his first kill, the grinding place where Naya had worked. The stones carried location memory, expanding the grave from a whole to a geographic anthology. The dead would rest not just in earth, but within a map of their life experiences. The ochre application became increasingly elaborate. Shara discovered that different consistencies created different effects. Thick paste stayed vibrant and three-dimensional. Thin washes soaked into skin, staining it permanently. She began to layer applications, creating depth and texture that made the bodies seem to glow. The red wasn't just color, it was transformation. The ochre turned human remains into artifacts, preservation into art. Death became not an ending, but a medium for new creation of meaning. Garrick, the memory keeper, contributed the most abstract addition: sound. He positioned hollow bird bones around the bodies in a pattern only he understood. When the cave breathed, as all caves do with changing temperature, the bones would whistle faintly. He explained through gestures that the dead needed voices, ways to speak to the living. The bones would sing for them. As the sun reached its peak, filtering through the cave entrance to touch the prepared grave, Shara made her final innovation. She took burning herbs and waved the smoke over the bodies, but then did something unprecedented. She sealed some of the smoking herbs in small clay vessels to be buried with them. The smoke would be trapped, traveling with the dead. It was the first attempt to capture and transport something as ephemeral as smoke, to give the dead not just objects, but atmospheres and essences. The children of the band, both sick and healthy, were brought to see the transformed bodies before covering. Instead of the terror that might be expected, they showed fascination. The ochre had converted death from horrible to beautiful. Little Kyle reached out to touch her sister's red-painted hand, leaving her own handprint in the pigment. Others followed, creating a record of the living on the transformed dead. The bodies became canvases for farewell, surfaces for final communication between worlds. The arrangement of bodies revealed an understanding that transcended their time. Without conscious mathematical knowledge, Shara had positioned the three deceased in a triangle formation that created perfect sightlines between them. Each face could see the others. None were isolated in death. When Jorin stood at the grave's edge, he noticed that from above the arrangement resembled the constellation they called the Hunters, 3 stars that guided night navigation. Sky pattern had been reproduced underground. More sick were dying, but now there was a template, a procedure that gave structure to grief. Each death became an opportunity to refine the ritual. A young mother who died holding her infant was buried with the child positioned at her breast, both covered in ochre mixed with milk from nursing mothers. The symbolism was clear. Nurturing continued beyond death. The positioning suggested that whatever force had taken them recognized and preserved their relationship. Death didn't sever bonds. It crystallized them. Vera made a crucial discovery while treating the sick. Those who participated in the burial preparations, despite their illness, seemed to find peace in their final hours. The ritual wasn't just for the dead, but for the dying. It removed the terror of the unknown, replacing it with procedure and beauty. She began bringing ochre to the sick, letting them paint themselves while still alive. Some recovered, others didn't, but all faced their uncertain futures with less fear, adorned in the color of transformation. The second grave required innovation. They couldn't keep digging in the same spot, so Jorin selected an alcove deeper in the cave. But this location received no sunlight, so they created artificial illumination. Torches were positioned to cast light in specific patterns, recreating the sun's angle from the first burial. They were standardizing the ritual while adapting to circumstances. The ochre helped here too. Its reflective properties made the bodies glow in torchlight, creating their own luminescence. Kyle, despite her youth, showed remarkable innovation in ochre preparation. She discovered that heating the powder before mixing created different hues, from bright orange to deep purple red. She began creating gradients on the bodies, lighter ochre on faces and hands, parts that touch the world, darker on torsos, the core of being. Her aesthetic choices carried meaning. The gradients suggested transition, the journey from light to dark, and perhaps back to light again. Art and theology were merging. The grave goods became increasingly sophisticated. Instead of just placing tools, they began modifying them specifically for burial. Spear points were deliberately broken, not destroyed, but transformed from functional to symbolic. Pottery was cracked in specific patterns that created designs. They were inventing the concept of ritual killing of objects, the idea that items needed to die to accompany the dead. This wasn't destruction, but transformation, parallel to what the ochre did to the bodies themselves. Garrick contributed a revolutionary element, the first buried art. He created small figurines from clay and ochre, abstract human forms that represented the deceased. These weren't portraits, but essence captures. A figure holding a baby for the mother, a figure throwing a spear for Dren. He placed these above the bodies before covering, explaining that these would stand guard, maintaining the deceased's presence in 2 realms simultaneously. The figurines were painted half in red ochre, half left natural clay. The covering of the graves became as ritualized as the preparation. Instead of simply filling the holes, they created layers. First, a thin layer of pure ochre powder, then soil mixed with ochre, then regular earth. Finally, stones arranged in patterns that meant something to the band, but would puzzle future archaeologists. The layering suggested stages of transition, degrees of separation between worlds. The dead weren't simply buried, they were gradually transitioned from one state of being to another. Shara introduced sound into the burial process. She discovered that different minerals mixed with ochre created different sounds when walked upon. Some crunched, others whispered. She created a pathway of these sound-making ochre compounds leading to the graves. Walking to visit the dead became a musical journey, each footstep announcing the approach of the living. The dead would never be surprised by visitors. This acoustic architecture turned the burial area into an interactive memorial space. The sick who recovered brought their own innovations. One woman who'd nearly died created ochre paintings on the cave wall showing the journey she'd experienced while fevered, figures walking through red landscapes, reaching a bright space, then returning. These weren't just fever dreams but maps of near-death experience. The paintings were done entirely in ochre variations, creating monochrome narratives that suggested the red earth wasn't just for the dead, but for anyone touching the boundary. Children began creating their own ochre rituals. They painted small stones and left them at the grave sites, messages to dead playmates. They mixed ochre with honey and created sweet pastes, food offerings for child spirits. Most remarkably, they began using ochre for healing play, painting sick dolls made of grass and then curing them by washing the ochre away. The red earth had become a medium for processing grief, fear, and hope. Through children's play, ochre transcended death to become about life. As the moon cycle completed, the band realized the sickness was retreating. 17 had died, but 15 sick had recovered. The correlation with the ochre burials seemed significant, even if the mechanism was unknown. Perhaps the ritual organization had improved hygiene. Perhaps the psychological comfort had boosted recovery. Or perhaps, as many believed, the proper treatment of the dead had appeased whatever force had brought the illness. The red earth had become medicine for both dead and living souls. 3 moons after the last burial, young Tam, who had recovered from the illness, made a discovery that would change everything. While gathering ochre from the sacred deposit, he found bones, ancient fossilized remains, stained red. But these weren't from their burials. These were older, perhaps from the ancestors Garrick's stories mentioned. The ochre staining had preserved them, keeping their shape while everything around had crumbled. The red earth wasn't just symbolic of eternal life, it literally preserved. This discovery triggered a revolution in burial practice. Shara began experimenting with ochre thickness, creating paste so dense it formed a shell around bodies. She mixed in tree resins that hardened the ochre into a protective coating. The bodies weren't just being painted, they were being encased, mummified in red crystal. The preservation was both physical and spiritual. The ochre locked the body in its arranged position, ensuring the careful positioning would last through deep time itself. Vera, ever the healer, made her own discovery. The ochre had antimicrobial properties. Bodies treated with it didn't putrefy the same way. They desiccated instead. The cave didn't fill with the smell of death. This practical benefit reinforced the spiritual significance. The red earth literally purified. She began using ochre in treating wounds among the living, creating a direct link between burial practice and medical treatment. The same substance that prepared the dead now healed the living. The band began to modify their living space based on burial knowledge. They created ochre-lined sleeping areas for the sick, believing the red earth provided protection. Mothers painted ochre circles around infant sleeping spots. Hunters wore ochre beneath their regular paint, a base layer of protection. The boundary between life and death rituals blurred. Every use of ochre among the living was practice for its ultimate application. Life became rehearsal for the final transformation that awaited everyone. Jorin, initially skeptical of elaborate burial rites, became their strongest advocate after a profound experience. While sitting vigil at his son's recovery, he'd seen moonlight hit the ochre-covered gravestones, making them glow like embers. In that moment he understood. The dead weren't gone but transformed into light, visible only under certain conditions. He began positioning mirrors of polished stone to direct sunlight onto graves at specific times, creating scheduled illuminations, visiting hours for souls. The ochre deposits themselves became sacred sites. The band developed elaborate protocols for gathering the red earth. Only certain people at certain times could collect it. The gathering became ritualized, prayers were offered, gifts were left in exchange. They weren't just taking pigment, but borrowing power. Interestingly, they began to notice that the richest ochre came from deposits near ancient burial sites, as if the earth itself had been enriched by proximity to intentional death and transformation. Kyle, now recognized as her mother's successor in ochre knowledge, made an innovation that would outlast them all. She began creating ochre maps on the cave walls, showing where each person was buried and their relationships to others. Lines of different ochre thickness connected parents to children, mates to each other, hunters to their hunting partners. The cave wall became a genealogical diagram in red, a family tree where death didn't end branches, but transformed them into a different type of growth. The recovered sick formed a special group within the band. Having touched death and returned, they were considered intermediaries. They were the ones who prepared bodies, who knew how to position limbs, how to apply ochre in meaningful patterns. They developed a complex symbolic language in ochre, spirals for lives that had produced many children, straight lines for those who died young, crosshatches for those who'd been leaders. Each body became a biographical text written in red mineral grammar. Trade with other bands began to center on ochre. Different groups had access to different qualities. Some had bright orange, others deep purple-red. They began exchanging ochres like precious stones. But more importantly, they exchanged burial knowledge. Other bands had developed their own death rituals, and ideas cross-pollinated. Some buried with flowers preserved in ochre paste, others with ochre-painted animal skulls. The red earth became a universal language for processing mortality across groups. Children born after the plague grew up in a culture where death was never hidden. They played with ochre from infancy, learned to paint before they could properly speak. Death wasn't fearsome, but familiar, another state of being that required preparation like any journey. These children would carry the ochre burial tradition forward, elaborating and refining it. Some would become specialists who traveled between bands, teaching the proper ways. The red earth had created humanity's first transferable profession. As seasons passed, the burial area of the cave became a place of power. People came there to make important decisions, to seek guidance, to remember. The ochre-stained ground was never walked upon casually. Footprints in the red dust were examined for meaning. Some claimed to hear voices in the acoustic ochre Shara had created. Others saw patterns in how ochre settled after rain. The burial ground had become an oracle, a place where the living could consult with those transformed by red earth. Garrick, now ancient himself, spent his last days creating the most elaborate ochre art the band had ever seen. Knowing his death approached, he painted his own burial instructions on the cave wall. But more than that, he painted the story of the plague, the first burials, the discovery of ochre's power. The painting used every technique they'd developed: layering, heating, mixing with other substances. It was simultaneously historical record, instruction manual and spiritual text, all rendered in variations of red. When Garrick finally died, his burial incorporated every innovation from the past years. His body was positioned as if teaching, arms arranged to gesture at his wall paintings. He was covered in so many layers of different ochre types that he seemed to be wearing a red garment. His grave goods included raw ochre, prepared ochre, and the tools for working it. Shara, now old, made one final innovation. She created ochre-based ink using animal blood as a binder. With this, she began marking the living, not just temporary paint, but permanent marks that would last a lifetime. These marks indicated who had survived the plague, who had helped with burials, who carried the knowledge. The living became walking memorials, their ochre marks linking them permanently to the transformed dead. The boundary between life and death states had become increasingly fluid. The last great innovation came from an unexpected source. A child born after the plague, who'd never known a world without ochre burials, suggested they create an eternal flame colored by ochre-bearing stones. When certain rocks were placed in fire, they released red smoke. This fire was maintained constantly at the burial ground entrance. The smoke carried ochre particles into the air, allowing the living to breathe the same substance that covered the dead. Every breath became a small death, a tiny transformation. As the original plague survivors aged, they realized they'd created something beyond mere burial practice. They'd invented the concept of sacred space, the idea that certain actions in certain places with certain substances could transcend normal reality. Young band's members learned not just how to bury, but how to think about death as transformation, rather than ending. The red earth had changed human consciousness itself. The final burial of the plague generation was Shara herself. By then, the Ochre traditions had evolved into elaborate ceremony involving 3 days of preparation. Her body was covered in 17 different types of ochre, each representing different aspects of her life and contributions. Her grave was lined with ochre paintings created by everyone she'd taught, but most remarkably, they buried her with unused ochre and clean brushes, tools for whatever painting might be needed in the place beyond death.